Enough with all the excuses. You know the West is on the move, it's out conquering and taking over all these other places. But where exactly are they going? Today, we review state expansion in Unit 6. If Unit 6 was a sentence, 6.2 would be the action verb. State expansion is literally what imperialism was. Now, there's a ton of different examples, and your teacher could have gone over any number of them during the year. So I'm not going to go empire to empire and colony to colony. Instead, let's review some of the main ideas as to how this went down. First, winners and losers. Let's start with the losers. And by losers here, I mean empires that actually declined in this period. The College Board mentions two: Spain and Portugal. Now, Spain is probably the biggest loser in this period after losing most of their American empire to Bolivar and the boys. But also they lost what was left of their empire to the United States at the very end of this period in 1898 in the Spanish-American War. That's Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. They broke the third rule of warfare: never go in against the United States when colonies are on the line. The other loser, Portugal, will lose the biggest chunk of its empire, Brazil, to independence, but they'll still hold on to Angola and Mozambique in southern Africa. Enough of the losers. The winners in this period will be the rest of the West and Japan. Empires like the US and Britain and France and Germany and Japan will all grow behind the might of their industrial economies and militaries. Next, methods. The College Board wants you to know it wasn't all just straight up conquering. These new empires will use both warfare and diplomacy to get their way. A prime warfare example is the Opium Wars in China. Britain got more ports opened, Hong Kong, more freedoms, and the ability to legally sell opium in China. Now, diplomacy just means negotiating. So the best example in this period of diplomacy is the Berlin Conference. This was when Otto von Bismarck held a meeting in Berlin for the diplomats of the major imperial powers to work out how they would take over Africa diplomatically. So whether by gunpoint or by treaty, the West and Japan were taken over. Next, settler colonialism. This is the only style of colonization mentioned by the College Board. Let's take New Zealand as an example. You may think New Zealand is just a place where the Lord of the Rings or Flight of the Conchords or Taika Waititi come from, but it's also a prime example of a settler colony. In a settler colony, the mother country, in this case Great Britain, is trying to replace the indigenous people with their own people from Britain. You can do this literally with violence by forcibly removing the people, or do it diplomatically with treaties or unfair policies. Britain did both. They fought the Maori Wars with the indigenous Maoris, and they signed treaties and land deals to remove the Maori from their own lands. So in a settler colony, a small minority from a mother country move into a colony and try to displace the populations there. If you find a small European group ruling over a much larger indigenous population, probably a settler colony. Next, neighborly conquering. Why go all the way around the world to conquer someone when you can just conquer the people next door? These are places like the United States, where Manifest Destiny drove the Americans all the way to the West Coast and even to Hawaii and purchasing Alaska. Or Russia's expansion into Siberia and into Central Asia. Or Japan's slow expansion into East Asia, creating what they called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Also, that's easily the best named empire of all time. It just rolls off the tongue. Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. It's a sphere in East Asia where everyone shares in the prosperity. Finally, who controls the colonies? Some of these colonies are going to go from private ownership to ownership from a mother country. So there's still some colonies controlled by private companies. Imagine if Amazon or McDonald's owned a colony. Well, King Leopold II owned the Congo for himself, and with no one overseeing him, he oversaw a regime that killed millions of Congolese. And until the 1850s, the British East India Company still owned most of India. In both cases, the country where those private entities originated came in and took over control of the colony. The Belgian state took the Congo from King Leopold II, and the British Empire took over control of India, creating what's known as the British Raj, or rule. So, when you think about new imperialism and how it went down, focus on the empires that grew in this period, their tactics in obtaining new territory, the idea of a settler colony, empires that conquered their direct neighbors, and finally the private entities that lost their control of territory to the state from which they originated. You think all these indigenous people are just going to roll out the welcome wagon and say, "Come on in, West. We need you here. We want you here. This is going to be fun." Let's talk about the indigenous populations and how they fought back. I'll see you tomorrow.